wonderful book, Reconstruction's Ragged Edge, the story of post-Civil War life in the Southern Mountains, particularly in western North Carolina. The bad news is he doesn't have any copies of it. They're all gone. I'm told you can still get it from Amazon, but I had a couple of requests for copies. Please have him bring books with him, and he told me this morning I'd be glad to oblige if I could, but they're gone. But you can order the book, and it's well worth whatever you have to pay for it. It's reasonable. It's a small book, and his books go today. I think you'll find that you get a very reasonable price on it. But more good news, he is working with a colleague on a longer book about Reconstruction in North Carolina that may not be published for a few more years. I think you said 2029.
Yeah, that's the plan.
Yeah, that's the plan. Well, I hope you can stick to it. I know you said you've been doing research for a couple of years. I know from personal experience that an 8-year window on a book is not as long as you might think it is. But I hope I'll still be here in 2029, and I'm looking forward to seeing it. Just a word about Steve Nash, quickly. He is a history professor at East Tennessee State University in Johnson City. You'll probably be able to tell when he gets up here that he's not a native North Carolinian or Tennessean, but he's kind of a North Carolinian by adoption, we think, because he lives in Weaverville, and part of his education was in North Carolina. He's a Penn State graduate who came south to the mountains in Western Carolina University by a circuitous route to do his first part of his undergraduate study. Got his master's degree there, and I believe he said 1999.
2001.
2001, okay. You started in 99, and then went to the University of Georgia for his PhD work. I want to say one more thing, and I promise I'll turn it over to him. There's some very interesting connections here. You've already seen Lusk Shotwell on the screen, and we talked about that in our newspaper release this morning. But Randolph Shotwell, that he'll be talking about, was the son of Nathan Shotwell, who was a Presbyterian minister, and there's a very interesting Polk County link here. I could make the argument that Tryon, as we know it today, might not exist were it not for Nathan Shotwell. Because Nathan Shotwell, who was Randolph Shotwell's father, Nathan Shotwell was a Presbyterian minister, and he had a classmate at Ohio University named Leland McAvoy. And I think that name may ring a bell with some of you. Lemuel Wilcox, he was the father-in-law of Lemuel Wilcox, and we look at them today as the founders of Tryon as we know it. Tryon City in the late 1860s and then incorporated in 1877. Nathan Shotwell took a pastorate of a Presbyterian church in Rutherford in 1859. We're not sure why he came to North Carolina. He kept moving south. He was an Ohio native who taught at a school in West Virginia, moved to Virginia, then North Carolina. Eventually, he ended up in the mountains of East Tennessee. But he was in Rutherford County from 1859 until after the war, and probably we have reason to believe that Mr. McAvoy, the Reverend McAvoy, Wilcox's father-in-law, might not have come to this part of the country had it not been for Nathan Shotwell. And his son Randolph Shotwell is somebody that Professor Nash will be talking about tonight along with Mr. Lusk, and it's a very interesting story. I won't try to steal any more of his thunder. I'll give you Steve Nash, Dr. Steve Nash.
Thank you. I might try to do this without the microphone, if people in the back can hear me without the microphone. Working all right? I sometimes lecture to rooms of 160, so I feel like I ought to be able to project well enough for people to hear me, but if you're not hearing me, I can switch to the microphone. It's really quite wonderful to be here. As I was sort of saying, this project and thing that I'm going to talk about today is kind of a bridge between something that I worked on and am currently working on, which is my avenue into this is Virgil Lusk. So I'm going to talk a lot about Virgil Lusk today. He does appear in my book, which I don't have any copies to sell, sadly, but you can order it online or place an order with your favorite local bookstore, and they can probably get it as well.
Okay, sure.
Virgil Lusk is the subject of a book that I'm currently editing for the University of Georgia Press, which I hope will come out and make Virgil accessible to people, because he's really not been particularly accessible. He's one of these people that seems to just pop up everywhere, and he lives a good long while. He dies in 1929, so he'll live a good long while. And Virgil Lusk is actually one of the ways that I got into my larger research project. As I was talking earlier with Dick before we came over, and I imagine it is probably apparent, I'm not a native Southerner, I'm a native Pennsylvanian actually. But I did my undergraduate degree at Penn State. I knew I wanted to do a graduate degree in history. I didn't get into the schools that I wanted to go to. And I was sitting in a professor's office, and he made a phone call to one of his former graduate students who was then teaching at Western Carolina University, and connected me. So I decided, okay, what's wrong with going from a university of about 50,000 people and about 40 to 50 bars downtown to a dry county in the southwestern corner of North Carolina with a student population of about 9,500. It was a leap. It was a good leap in the end. But I remember very clearly sitting in my advisor's office. His name is Peter Carmichael. And I remember sitting in Pete's office, and we were just going back and forth, what are you going to write your thesis on? What are you going to research? Well, what about this? What about that? What about this? And I think finally it was Pete that goes, well, what about Reconstruction? And I was like, huh, that's interesting. Because nobody's really thought about Reconstruction in the mountains. Because when you think about the Civil War era in the Southern Mountains, inevitably people start going to these sort of default assumptions, right? It was overwhelmingly Unionist. Well, East Tennessee was, but not all of the Southern Mountains were overwhelmingly Unionist, right? So, move past that. There was no slavery here. Also not true. So, what does Reconstruction, which is a period that is fundamentally about two things. It's fundamentally about restoring the Union, sounds easy, and about defining freedom for roughly 4 million formerly enslaved people. What's that going to look like? How's that going to play out? And how's it going to play out in a region that overall had about a 10%, 12% African American population in 1865? How are those issues of restoring the Union and emancipation going to play out in this region? And I was at Western Carolina University, so it makes perfect sense. I'll write about Western North Carolina. So for any of you who have ever done research or gotten a master's or wrote a paper as an undergraduate, right? One of the first things a professor is going to say to you is, well, go find out if it's even doable, right? Go look at your sources, see what's out there. And some of the first sources I looked at were the Freedmen's Bureau records, which are going to play a role in the stuff that we talk about here today. And then the other one was Virgil Lusk. And Virgil Lusk sort of jumped out pretty quickly. And he's the guy, I put a nice little red arrow there that you can see what he looked like as a Confederate officer. And then his counterpart there, the aforementioned Randolph Shotwell. So Virgil Lusk kind of caught my eye very quickly because he was very vocal in the attempts to prosecute the Ku Klux Klan during Reconstruction. And he popped up again and again in terms of federal testimony or records. Virgil Lusk, here he is, he's the prosecutor, here he is, he's testifying before Congress again. And he was eminently quotable. Gruff, direct, didn't really seem to care what people thought about what he was saying. One of his most famous exchanges, and sort of go ahead and use it now as a way of introduction, is he was testifying before a Senate committee. He was testifying before a Senate committee, and they were asking him about what was going on in Western North Carolina in 1871. And he's testifying, and he finally comes to the point, and they say, well, what would you do? If you're in charge, what would you do to suppress the Ku Klux Klan? And Lusk says, well, hang about 500 of them. And the senator kind of, shocked, like, what, and literally he says the application of hemp, hang about 500 people. And the senator's like, are you serious? And Lusk says, yes. He says, I was a former Confederate, I came back, I expected consequence, right? And so he basically said, if you're not willing to hang them, you can pay the Confederate war debt, you can return their slave property, and more or less surrender to the Confederacy. That would be the alternative. That's a guy who didn't really seem to care what people thought of him, because the North Carolina newspapers seized on that immediately. How are we going to deal with Reconstruction? We're going to hang people, so says Virgil Lusk. So Virgil Lusk, eminently quotable guy, but yet, as I went looking for him, there were no, there's that next thing, there's no personal papers immediately available. There wasn't a lot there. And through the sort of, gift of digitization and whatnot, I'm finding more, I'm compiling it, and hopefully it's all going to come out and be readable, and people will get to know Virgil Lusk in sort of total for the first time. But what Virgil Lusk knew, and he lived a good long while, so he knew a lot of things, but one of the things he knew is that he was going to be inextricably tied in history to the man on your left, Randolph Shotwell. And the reason for that is because, as I guess was alluded in the publicity for this, in 1869, Randolph Shotwell caned Virgil Lusk on the northwest corner of the public square of what is now Pack Square in downtown Asheville. And it became a huge event locally. Surprisingly, did not get a lot of press attention throughout the state. But Lusk knew that in the future, when the history was told, he and Shotwell were always going to be in the same breath. They were going to be connected. And much of what we know and comes out of this comes from the fact that even late in life, Lusk was defending himself against Randolph Shotwell. So let's kind of backstep now. Let's kind of look at these two guys, get a sense of who they were. I'm going to sort of tell the stories and go through this, and at the end I'll try to pull back and say this is why I think this all kind of matters, like what the big takeaway point is. And I'll try to do this all in about 35 minutes, which is no easy thing, because once you put me in front of a crowd, I'll keep talking. So, quick biographies about the two. And let's start with Lusk, because he was the older of the two. Virgil Lusk was born in 1836. He will die in 1929. So he lives a good long while. He was born in 1836 on what are called the Flats of Spring Creek, in what is now Madison County, North Carolina, but at the time was Buncombe County. The Lusk family is technically one of the first families of Buncombe. His father came into the area in the 1780s, I believe. So Virgil Lusk and his sort of family is one of the first white families to settle into Buncombe County. He was the youngest of 9 children. So he was the youngest of 9 children. And I think for that reason, Virgil got a little bit more of an educational opportunity than his siblings got. And that's not to say that he got a lot in the way of education. His family didn't have a lot of money. They had a lot of land, but not necessarily a lot of money. His father was a farmer. His brothers were farmers. Another one of his brothers was a minister. And if for some reason you find yourself roaming around in the sort of areas of Buncombe, Madison County, and you find yourself up around Sandy Mush and move through that area, there's a little community called Luck, which is probably a corruption of Lusk. But his brother was the minister at a church in Luck. So, that's where Virgil comes from. He did not have much in the way of formal education. He did manage to attend for a while what was called the Little Sandy Mush Academy. So in the 1850s, he attended a sort of early academy. When he graduated from that, he decided that he was going to become a lawyer, and he largely self-taught himself to be a lawyer. Not unusual at the time, right? Abraham Lincoln, famously self-taught lawyer. But, at the time it was more typical. His sort of peers, the people that he would be sort of generationally grouped with, Zebulon Vance, Augustus Merriman, these were all people who read law with famous established lawyers, people like Nicholas Woodfin in Asheville. So Lusk is kind of a DIY lawyer. He did it himself. And yeah, this is fine.
Too dark, Helen?
You can't,
Yeah.
sorry.
So he tells the story of basically taking his young wife, he had gotten married, to a woman named Mary Jane Candler, which was a fortuitous thing for Virgil because the Candler family was well off, right? Candler, North Carolina, that's his in-laws that give the name to that community. So he takes Mary Jane, who he calls Molly. He goes back to the old family home place up along the flats of Spring Creek, reads law for better part of a winter and a spring, passes the bar exam, sets up a shingle in downtown Marshall, and starts practicing law before the Superior Court right on the eve of the Civil War. So he starts practicing law. He gets swept up in secession sentiment. Young man, not surprising. Right? A lot of ambitious people saw the Civil War as an opportunity. Lusk volunteers, first for an infantry battalion, later is going to shift to a cavalry battalion. He will become a captain in the Confederate cavalry. Most of Lusk's military service is going to be in southern Appalachia. He's going to spend most of his time, after a brief foray into Virginia, he's going to spend most of his time over in East Tennessee, around Cumberland Gap. He is going to be tagged to go along on a sort of rescue mission in 1863. In the summer of 1863, a Confederate cavalry officer by the name of John Hunt Morgan had launched a raid into Ohio. The Confederates were afraid that Morgan was going to get cut off, isolated, and captured, so they sent Lusk and other Confederate units, sent them after him to try to relieve the pressure. In the end, Lusk gets himself captured in August of 1863. And as an officer, he gets sent to Johnson's Island up on Lake Erie. And Lusk is going to spend the remainder of the war, so from the summer of 1863 until the spring of 1865, a prisoner of war. And we'll allude to in a minute, talk about in a minute, wasn't very happy about it. Let's talk about Randolph Shotwell. Shotwell is about 9 years younger. He's 8 years younger than Virgil Lusk. He is, as was sort of mentioned, the son of Nathan Shotwell, a Presbyterian minister, Princeton-educated man. Nathan Shotwell, as was alluded to, moved around. Randolph was born in what is now West Virginia. So he and Virgil are both native Appalachians, even if maybe Randolph wouldn't see it that way. But they're both native Appalachians. Randolph had all the educational opportunities that Virgil did not have. He was given excellent opportunities to go to school. In fact, during the secession crisis in 1860-61, he was a student in the North. And he decided, as a teenager, that he was going to make his way back to the South, or to the South, and volunteer for, as he writes in his memoir, the first Confederate unit he found, which turned out to be the 8th Virginia Infantry. So he volunteers and joins the 8th Virginia Infantry. Randolph's experience in the war is very different from Virgil's in certain regards. As part of Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, Randolph Shotwell saw action in a large number of engagements in the main theater in Virginia. He fought at Gettysburg, took part in the Pickett-Pettigrew assault at Gettysburg. Ultimately, he is going to be captured as well in 1864. Randolph Shotwell will be captured around Cold Harbor in Virginia, and he will also be sent off to a prisoner of war camp. He'll ride out the duration of the war, mostly at Fort Delaware. So that's our two protagonists here, or antagonists, as they would sort of become, in a nutshell. A relatively well-to-do, or at least well-educated son of a minister who moved around a fair bit, but spent really kind of the bulk of his life in the North. A native Buncombe County young man, a sort of do-it-yourself trained lawyer who started his career and his life as a married man just on the eve of the Civil War. Both Confederates, both would end the war as officers. Both are going to come back to North Carolina once the war is over. And that's where things start to change. And that's where a lot of the sort of narrative starts to pick up. Shotwell had actually never lived in North Carolina. Randall had never lived in North Carolina. And then the war is over, and his father's living in Rutherfordton. So he decides he's going to move to North Carolina. So he, like a lot of veterans of Lee's army, starts walking home. I'm not 100% sure how Virgil Lusk got home, but I know he did. And I know that when he got home, one of the first times he shows up in the historical record after the war's end is a warrant was issued in 1865 in Madison County against 2 residents in Madison County who had threatened to kill him. So this is one of those things about Appalachia after the war, right? Things are very divided. Loyalties were very divided. Western North Carolina, to the extent that you can kind of average out these things, would say maybe a 60-40 pro-Confederate region. So, you know, they're coming back to, for Lusk, a region that was more in support of his cause, but there was a sizable dissenting population amongst the white population. Shotwell actually goes first to the coast, sets up a newspaper with a partner in New Bern, and then when that fails, comes to Rutherfordton. Sort of comes to Rutherfordton for the first time after the Civil War. And once they're there, now the question is, what's going to happen, right? What's Reconstruction? How is it going to play out? How can these two guys tell me something about Reconstruction? And we're going to use Randolph Shotwell as our sort of entree into this. Randolph Shotwell wrote a memoir that was edited and put out in 3 volumes by a historian by the name of James G. DeRulac Hamilton. I love his name when you say his full name. It's Joseph Gregor DeRulac Hamilton. J.G. DeRulac Hamilton edited Shotwell's memoir, put it out in the 1920s, I believe, or 1930s, somewhere in there. Long after Shotwell's death, I would add. Shotwell died in 1885. So, in his memoir, Randolph Shotwell sums up Reconstruction in 5 points. And you see the bullet points here, and I'm going to kind of read you the long version as sort of a basis for starting this conversation about Reconstruction. His first point, I simplified it as the Freedmen's Bureau. He described it as, quote, the rapid and arrogant advent of the Freedmen's Bureau, with its petty despots in every town and village, holding courts at all hours of day or night, and devoting every effort to create antagonism between the whites and their latent slaves. So that's Shotwell's first and most important point, the Freedmen's Bureau. You want to understand Reconstruction, you got to understand the Freedmen's Bureau. Second part, I simplified it here, is military occupation and radical Reconstruction. This is generally the period, right, starting in 1867 after Congress passes the quote-unquote Reconstruction Acts, which turns the former Confederate states into 5 military districts. North Carolina was part of the 2nd military district along with South Carolina. Shotwell calls these, quote, the military satrapies set up by act of Congress and inspired with intense malice against the, and I would underscore this for later argument, better classes of the South by the radical leaders, radical capital R meaning Republicans, aided by the press, platform, and pulpit, who required the bitterest partisanry at the hands of all their agents and instruments ruling the South. Without such display or malicious partisanship, there was no hope of preferment or reward or even permanent employment by any officer in the service. In other words, if you're someone like Randolph Shotwell and you're a former Confederate and you're coming home, you're not going to find much opportunity in this sort of occupied, military-controlled former Confederacy. Number 3, the coming of the carpetbagger, aka the northern-born Republican. The coming of the carpetbagger, called by the, and here's where he gets clever, and he was clever, and he's using a play off of the Freedmen's Bureau, and he calls them bureaucrats, to seize and rend and tear the helpless people whom Ulysses S. Grant's bayonets held pinioned to earth. For sake of argument, I would point out there aren't too many carpetbaggers necessarily running around in western North Carolina after the Civil War. Most of them are in the sort of Piedmont and other sections, but we could get technical about that. Number 4, the Union League. The Union League was a wartime organization that was a secret organization to help protect pro-Union residents of the South. It continues into the post-war period, and that's where Shotwell really kind of takes aim at it. So his version of number 4, my short version, the Union League, his version, the organization of secret oath-bound leagues among the Negroes under the direction and control of the carpetbaggers as a means of more thoroughly carrying out the designs of the Bureau agents, all comes back to the Freedmen's Bureau, in respect to a conflict of races and the banding of the blacks for quote-unquote base purposes. Number 4 starts to sound a little hypocritical when you think about number 5 and where Randolph Shotwell's story is ultimately going to go, which is number 5 is the Ku Klux Klan. Or, as Shotwell would phrase it, the organization of the White Brotherhood, commonly called the Ku Klux Klan, as a defensive association to protect the women of the South against personal assault at the hands of the Negro assailants, who were protected by the United States representatives in all their outrages both against the person and property of Southerners. That's Randolph Shotwell's 5-point introduction to Reconstruction. It's a fairly standard quote-unquote lost cause view of Reconstruction, certainly one that J.G. DeRollick Hamilton believed in. But let's kind of break it down, and let's kind of categorize Shotwell's points here. I think if we were to sort of use these as a basis for conversation moving forward, I think in some ways we can distill it down to 3 broad points. There's an underlying one, but 3 broad points. Division. On one hand, we're talking about a divided region of whites divided by wartime loyalties, whites divided by class, and also race. Power, number 2. Who should rule? Who ultimately should be in charge of this former Confederacy? Who should be in charge of the state governments? Who should hold power in this new Reconstruction era? Links back to the first when you consider his language about the better, number 2 actually, the better whites, the better classes. And then the third one, violence. If you can't ultimately achieve the first 2 through legal means, use violence as your third option. And that's where the Ku Klux Klan comes into the equation. Let's start in breaking these down. Let's start by talking about Shotwell's favorite organization. And this is a map, and I put the link to the people who did it, Mapping the Freedmen's Bureau. Wonderful project. It's worth, and I've been using this map now for years, which is wonderful because it's a topographical kind of modern map. And you can see the way that the Freedmen's Bureau was scattered across North Carolina. Here's parts of South Carolina, which is relevant to stuff that comes later. You can see that probably, I guess it's debatable which of the Bureau agent or offices would still be closest here, probably still Asheville. But one of the things that Shotwell is, of course, railing against is the creation of these Freedmen's Bureau offices. And just so that we're all on the same page, the Freedmen's Bureau's formal name is the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. It was popularly called the Freedmen's Bureau because its number 1 mission was to aid the South's transition from a slaveholding society to a free labor society. And what I find really fascinating about this is that in a lot of ways, the Freedmen's Bureau was the most tangible, the most accessible form of federal governmental power in Western North Carolina after the Civil War. The military, which is, in 1867 to 1869, the military is still pretty sizable, but scaled down from what it was in 1865, for sure. The military is largely centered in Morganton at this time. Makes sense, right? At this time, this is the westernmost terminus of what becomes the Western North Carolina, what is the Western North Carolina Railroad, right? So they are at the far edge of their communication supply line by railroad. So that leaves all of this sort of mountainous terrain to be policed and sort of looked after by basically 4 offices. This one is Franklin down in Macon County. This is Asheville, Wilkesboro, and Jefferson up in Ashe County. And the Freedmen's Bureau had pretty wide sort of latitude in what it is that they were allowed to do. There are guardrails protecting this, but they had fair degree of latitude. And the things that they get most involved with are negotiating labor contracts for African Americans. They help them negotiate labor contracts. They help to guarantee that those labor contracts are paid, which was a big deal because a lot of former enslavers tried to get out of paying their formerly enslaved people as free workers. And then they also got involved in court cases. If African Americans were not having their rights protected, the Freedmen's Bureau had the opportunity to intervene. They had the power to intervene. And this is a sort of avenue back into this story, which is that the Freedmen's Bureau in Asheville actively intervened, frequently and often. And the Freedmen's Bureau agent there, who, this is where I say we could get technical, he's a New Yorker. He was stationed in Asheville for a while. He's probably the closest thing we have a carpetbagger in this sort of story. His name's Oscar Eastman. Eastman gets actively involved in court cases involving African Americans, overturns multiple convictions, becomes very unpopular in circles of the sort of white former elite who denounce him in various terms. People like Augustus Merriman, not a fan of Oscar Eastman. And here's where Lusk comes back into the story. Because all of a sudden, former Confederate officer Virgil Lusk starts popping up in the Freedmen's Bureau correspondence. Because when these cases are happening, lo and behold, and they're talking about lawyers in Asheville, the Freedmen's Bureau agent is saying, if we need somebody to prosecute this, I recommend Virgil Lusk. And here's where you start seeing him come back into the record. 1867, he's going around and he's giving speeches to white and black Republican, soon-to-be Republican organizations, notably the Union League. And he's advising African Americans on their legal rights. He is being tagged by the Bureau agent to intervene and sort of prosecute these cases. And what's really going to make Lusk perhaps, well, 2 things that are going to make him particularly onerous to someone like Randolph Shotwell. First, Lusk is going to rise in power partly because of the military, which is interesting. You have this former Confederate officer, POW, who now, after the war, becomes a Republican, which, in the parlance of the time, earned you the sort of epithet of scalawag. And Lusk becomes a Republican, aiding the Freedmen's Bureau, which is an assertion of federal power in the mountain region. In not entirely unprecedented way, but really the Civil War was the opening of the big federal intervention into the region. Reconstruction continues that, and Lusk seems pretty content to use federal power to achieve ends within his community. Lusk seems to believe that this is an opportunity for whites who traditionally had been held out of the political governing coalition to seize power and have their voices heard. So a lot of lower class whites, people who maybe didn't have a whole lot or didn't achieve a sort of high education, saw this as an opportunity where now the sort of traditional ruling elite were no longer in charge. The Freedmen's Bureau was an ally to help shift the equation in their favor. And Lusk begins aiding prosecutions, helps sort of supporting the Freedmen's Bureau in this way. He benefits from the military directly Because in 1868, the military is going to order the removal of another former Confederate officer by the name of David Coleman, who had been district solicitor, so district prosecutor. Coleman gets removed. Who gets appointed in his place? Virgil Lusk. So he is largely appointed by the military, the US military. So, Lusk is now in a position to do legal aid for the Freedmen's Bureau. And one of the things that the Freedmen's Bureau was very good at was registering voters. I was mentioning to Dick that if I had known this earlier, I would have maybe shifted the talk to be a little bit more emancipation-oriented, since yesterday would have been Nina Simone's birthday. But the Freedmen's Bureau was extremely active in 1867 in registering black men to vote for the first time. And what you see here is a Harper's Weekly artistic rendering, which I've found a colorized version of African Americans being registered to vote in Asheville. So this would have been happening through 1867, gearing up for state elections in 1868. The Freedmen's Bureau was very effective. In fact, the Freedmen's Bureau was put in charge of registering voters. And of course, at this time, former Confederates not allowed to vote, many of them. So like Zebulon Vance can't vote in 1868, but now African American men can. So for a lot of whites, that was very unpopular. Not a problem for Virgil Lusk, I would add, but for people like Randolph Shotwell, that's a problem. But they register African Americans to vote in 1867 across the region. And in 1868, black men are going to vote for the first time in a Reconstruction election. And I'm going to kind of use this kind of chart here, table. I always underscore bunkum because that's one of my good illustrations. You can see Polk, right? 79.2% of the registered electorate in 1867, 68 was white, 20.8% was African American. Buncombe County is 81.5% white, 18.5% African American. I think what's really kind of interesting about this campaign to register black voters, and one of the things that's really going to stick to people like Shotwell about this, is that in Western North Carolina, African Americans are not a population majority, not the way that they might be in certain eastern counties, but they prove to be a very powerful swing vote. Because if you look at the outcome of the election, and they were voting on a constitution, which is still the basis of the modern state of North Carolina Constitution, was written during Reconstruction. You can see that the Republican, William Holden, in Buncombe County gets 54.5% of the vote. For our argument, gets overwhelming support in Polk County. There were about 424 registered black voters in Buncombe County. The Republican carries the county by just over 200 votes. So this number looks like it's pretty decisive, but it's a margin of, just a couple hundred votes. If you assume, and statistically, African Americans overwhelmingly voted Republican for pretty much every election almost until 1900. So if we assume that just half of the registered black men in Buncombe County voted Republican, they're the margin of victory in that county. If you go up to a place like Watauga County, where Appalachian State is, the Republicans carried Watauga County by 4 votes. There are 36 registered black voters in Watauga County. So, in Western North Carolina, black voters are not the majority. They're not even close to a majority, but they're incredibly significant swing voter. And they're going to swing the election in the counties towards the Republicans. And people like Virgil Lusk, who will get elected as solicitor in 1868. That is not going to go well with people like Randolph Shotwell, who believe that the better class, the sort of elite, the former elite of the South, should govern. And the result is going to be violence. William Holton, the Republican, wins the gubernatorial election in 1868. In the spring, he's inaugurated in July 4th, actually, of 1868. The period between then and the presidential and congressional elections that November get really quite dicey in Western North Carolina, because they start to get reports for the first time during that period that there is an organization calling itself the Ku Klux Klan in operation in Western North Carolina. And this is actually one of my very first big research finds, which is, this is a Ku Klux threat that was included in a document that I found while doing research for my master's thesis, which then became the book. The Ku Klux Klan enters into Western North Carolina. The Freedmen's Bureau is reporting up the chain to the military that they fear that a race war is coming in Western North Carolina, that everywhere African Americans are going at this time, they're going armed. They're hearing rumblings of an organization that is perhaps going to lead towards violence. This particular Klan threat was included on a door of a black carpenter who was working in Haywood County in Waynesville. The Freedmen's Bureau agent passes it up the chain, basically says, look, we got a presidential election coming in November, I need troops. They write back and say, no troops coming. Governor was just elected, he's a Republican, Reconstruction's going well, we're going to start scaling down, troops are actually going to start leaving the state, no troops are coming. What happens? The election comes on November 3rd of 1868, Nashville, and violence breaks out. We don't know exactly the cause of it, but we know the casualties. One African American man killed, more than a dozen wounded. We don't know exactly how it started. There's arguments. But what we do know is that one of the people writing at the time wrote, just 2 weeks after the event, this was an act of the Ku Klux Klan. Fast forward, early 1869. Virgil Lusk is a solicitor, he's a prosecutor. He brings charges against about 20 people in Madison County, claiming that they had led a raid at night in masks against 3 people in Madison County, 2 white Republicans and a black Republican. And he claims that basically there's no way to prosecute this because the witnesses, everybody would say, we know nothing about it, we will not say anything, and when he tries to interrogate them under oath, they basically say, you know, they'll kill us, we're not going to say anything. So Lusk brings charges. At that time, there was a young newspaper editor who had just moved to Asheville, who created a newspaper that he called the Asheville Citizen. His name was Randolph Shotwell. Shotwell, who was he had a bit of a sharpness to his writing. He published an editorial criticizing Lusk for his actions in Madison County. Lusk took offense to it. And if anybody has these editorials, please give them to me because I can't find them anywhere. I suspect that they exist in a scrapbook somewhere. That somewhere somebody has a scrapbook that's been passed down generationally and they don't know what they have. But nobody has ever found this editorial exchange. Because what happens is Shotwell's paper runs an editorial against Lusk. Lusk says that they accused him of such things as prostituting his office. Lusk responded in kind in an editorial over his own signature in the Republican newspaper. After Lusk's editorial, the local Ku Klux gets together. They talk about what should happen. They say, you know, this solicitor needs to be corrected. He needs to be disciplined. He needs to be made an example of. So they debate about what to do, and they decide that the editor of the newspaper who published it should be the person to carry out the discipline. So as Virgil Lusk in early 1869 is standing there alongside James Merriman, Augustus Merriman's brother, another lawyer, and they're standing on the northwest quarter of what is now Pack Square, and they're talking about some sort of legal matter. Lusk's version is that out of nowhere, Randolph Shotwell came up behind him, sprang upon him, and started hitting him over the head repeatedly with a cane. And, right, this is not an unusual form of political violence, right? All you have to do is think of Charles Sumner in the 1850s. And the idea of chastising somebody in this way is to not, right, Southern honor, the gentlemanly code, where you walk up to somebody and you sort of exchange and you say, okay, we will settle this like men, and you go out onto the field of honor and those sorts of things. You do that when you consider the person your equal. Lusk being attacked this way by Shotwell was a way of saying that he was deemed inferior. So Shotwell begins beating Lusk over the head with his cane. Lusk staggers, falls down, braces himself with his left hand, and pulls out his pistol. And Lusk says that he couldn't see anything other than Shotwell's legs, which he says was probably a good thing for Shotwell. And I can tell you it was a good thing for Shotwell, because Virgil Lusk was an ace on the Asheville Rifle Club in the 1880s. So if Lusk had had the opportunity to stand and point, he would have killed the man. Instead, he shot him through both thighs. A bullet passed through both thighs, at which point Shotwell sort of staggers back and then raises up his arms and says, "I am unarmed," which I find kind of hilarious, that here he's beating somebody over the head, and I'm unarmed. And Shotwell's version of this, as you might suspect, is quite different. He claims that Virgil Lusk was more or less pacing along the northwest corner of Pack Square, waiting and lying in wait for Shotwell to appear. And Shotwell, having forgotten to pack his pistol that day, decided that the best thing he could do was to start hitting Lusk before Lusk could shoot first, and then proceeds to attack, and then Lusk shoots him, and Shotwell says it was completely unwarranted. But what's interesting about this is Shotwell's paper fails. He leaves Asheville. He rematerializes a couple, he goes back to Rutherford, where he reorganizes and joins, in that interim, joins the Ku Klux Klan formally. And Shotwell will, skip past that. He joins the Ku Klux Klan formally. He says he didn't, but he did. And he becomes a leader in the Rutherford County Klan, which incorporated much of this area. They coordinated, the way that the Ku Klux worked is they often coordinated with outside areas. So the idea being, right, is that if you are trying to carry out extra-legal violence and you're doing it against people that know you, you're pretty easily identified. So the way that they would do it is they would call in people from South Carolina. And people from South Carolina would come across the border and carry out a raid, and then they would return the favor, etc. But what happened in April of 1871 is that the Rutherford Klan decided that a local Republican had gone so far that he had to be corrected, and they carried out a large-scale raid on the county seat of Rutherfordton against a lawyer by the name of James Justice. They pulled Justice out in the middle of the night, beat him up, told him that they were going to kill him. Justice identified Shotwell as being there. Shotwell claims that he was in bed at the time with two other people in a boarding house, more or less, that there was no way he could have been there. Ultimately, the courts disagreed. Randolph Shotwell, is the highest-ranking member of the North Carolina Ku Klux Klan convicted of a crime and sentenced to prison. In 1872, he would be sent to Albany Penitentiary in New York State. He is the highest-ranking Ku Klux that will be convicted of a crime. So, how do we kind of make sense of these stories and these sort of two men and seemingly similar backgrounds on the same side during the war, but arguably clearly on opposite sides of arguably a different style of war after the shooting war ended in 1865? What do we make of this? I think there's a number of different ways that we can sort of interpret and make sense of this, the similar men on different paths. One of which is, I think Shotwell and Ku Klux at this time fervently believed that what was happening around them was deeply illegitimate. That they believed that the empowerment and the citizenship given to former enslaved people, the rise of power to lower class whites and people like Virgil Lusk, was an affront to the classical society of the ante-Dom South, the sort of a white elite who had traditionally governed, and putting these sort of lower class, and they would refer to them repeatedly as sort of base or bad men, in power was, and he uses this language repeatedly, essentially an affront to the Constitution. That it was an affront against what the Constitution was designed to do. And of course, part of that was that he believed the Constitution was designed to protect the power of white men. So Shotwell fervently believed that the Ku Klux was what he said it was. That it was a defensive organization that was designed to protect and sort of guarantee the power of the better class of whites. That doesn't mean that he's right. It also means that he believed what he said, but I think also on some level probably understood that he was wrong in the sense that I think Randolph Shotwell, by the time he wrote his memoir, had recognized that in some ways he'd been used. That political leaders had used his sort of prowess with the pen to wage a print war against Republicans and against Reconstruction. And when Shotwell needed their support politically, none was coming. They would basically turn their back on him. And Shotwell would never name names. He would never name names. They wanted him to very much. But he would never name names. But when you read his post-war writing and you can get the sense that he recognizes that he proved to be a useful tool, but not, in the end, he became toxic. He would have some success after the war, but not to the measure that he certainly himself had aspired to. And he was a deeply ambitious individual. Lusk, interestingly, if the sort of Ku Klux Klan and violence sort of stymies Shotwell's career, it launches Lusk's. Virgil Lusk is going to go from being a district solicitor to a statewide prosecutor, where he is going to become an assistant district attorney for the United States over a newly created Western District in 1872. And in 1870 and 71, when the state is prosecuting Ku Klux across the state, Virgil Lusk was tabbed to essentially, in some ways, be, and forgive the contemporary reference, in some ways to be the kind of Robert Mueller of his time. He was sent around to do all these interviews, to organize local prosecutions and collect all this evidence. And the reason why I use the parallel is because if you remember the news coverage, like the anticipation, like what's Mueller doing? What's Mueller doing? The same thing was going on with Lusk. All of a sudden there'd be these news stories like Lusk's in Lincolnton. What's Lusk doing in Lincolnton? Who's he looking into? And then Lusk is in New Bern. What's Lusk doing in New Bern? All these sorts of stories. And he parlays and he goes from that towards being a U.S. district attorney, a multi-time state legislator, and he'll be a practicing lawyer up until his death. He tries his last case before the state Supreme Court at the age of 93. So Lusk is going to stick around for a good long while. And I think in looking at this story, one of the things that it reminds us is that Reconstruction was this moment in time. And I always sort of tell my students to guard against the idea of this is just the way it was, or everything was sort of fixed, or you assume, well, as people living in Appalachia, we shouldn't assume that everybody in the South was loyal to the Confederacy, because we know that they weren't. There was a sizable Unionist population in southern Appalachia, right? There is no neat linear line here. There's no uniquely solid South during Reconstruction. There was a lot of division, a lot of messiness. People like Virgil Lusk were willing to share power, willing to embrace and by action defend African American freedom. At the same time that deeply conservative people like Randolph Shotwell, who wanted to return to the ante-Dom status quo, in the end were willing to utilize violence to stop that. So there was this sort of moment in time where change appeared to be happening, and Lusk and Shotwell kind of get right to the heart of it. And as Virgil Lusk would say, he knew that in the future he and Randolph Shotwell would be forever tied in history. And they are. And thank you very much for your listening and patience, and I welcome questions and comments and all that.
I'll take that one.
All right, so I'm helping today,
Sure.
Steve, on what happens after a formal presentation. Who has a question or remark for our speaker today that's about what he says and about the big picture? Ellen Thomas.
Yes, you listed 5 things that
Uh-huh.
Shotwell was talking about,
Mhm.
and you didn't really tell about number 4, which was the union.
The Union League?
Yeah.
The Union League was a wartime sort of secret organization that was designed to promote pro-union sentiment and to organize and protect unionists living within the Confederate States. And then after the war, it kind of reorganizes and evolves and becomes an organization towards uniting African Americans and whites politically and sort of defense of the Union. And that very quickly, by 1867, becomes a vehicle for organizing Republican sentiment and a Republican Party in the state of North Carolina, which is the birth of the North Carolina Republican Party in March of 1867. And the Union League will organize and help create that coalition, and then it more or less is gone by 1868, which is one of the issues for Shotwell. Is he was very anti-Union League, and he often used the Union League as a sort of justification for why they needed their own secret society to put down this secret society, which really wasn't that secret. Like, you can find newspaper post saying the Union League will be meeting in the courthouse square at such and such time. And so, but because of what they were doing politically, the Ku Klux becomes justified in sort of a counterweight. So that's one of the ways that he will sell it.
Right. Others, remarks or questions on the big picture of what Steve was sharing with us today?
I just wonder, where were the American Indians?
Yeah, that's a great question. That would be an entirely different and new book, and one that would probably be very helpful to have. The Cherokee, the Eastern Band of the Cherokee are tied into Reconstruction in an interesting way, in the fact that their land holdings and deeds were tied up in the legacy and business dealings of William Holland Thomas. William Holland Thomas is declared insane during Reconstruction. His business dealings go sideways. There's all sorts of claims on the lands, and they end up in court. And there's a lot of legal wrangling back and forth as to who actually owns the lands and how they're going to get secured or not secured. And it's all happening in the 1860s, 1870s. I've gone down to Atlanta, and I've been going through a bunch of court cases. And I can tell you that Lusk was involved on some of those court cases because they are there in the case files. I don't know what he was doing because the way that those case files are organized, they don't give you the testimony or the prosecution in the files. It's more all the sort of logistical stuff in carrying out a court case. But I can tell you that William Holland Thomas's papers are voluminous. They're microfilmed. There's a lot to tease out there, but it's difficult because mentally he's not healthy. And so it's unclear what's going on in a lot of these things. I will plug here, and this is not for me, but I will say that if you're looking and interested in some of this stuff and William Holland Thomas and broader things, there's a website, a blog that's kind of dormant now, but it's called Tangled Roots. And it's a descendant of William Holland Thomas, and she has a lot of Western North Carolina families that are connected in her sort of ancestry. And she and her husband are working on a book that hopefully will pull a lot of this stuff out. But she's a national freelance nonfiction writer, so I think it's going to be part her grappling with her sort of family's history and part telling the history. So hopefully some of that's going to get out. But yeah, it's tied up in there, but it's really messy. So yeah, same thing. If anybody has a question about the Western North Carolina Railroad, which gets tied up in fraud, same sort of thing. It is a mess. It is an absolute tangled legal nightmare to try to figure out exactly who did what and how and when and who was, yeah. So, anyway.
Mark?
Okay, my ancestry goes from Burke County to McDowell County to Rutherford County and Polk County.
Okay.
And I'm not aware that any of my ancestors were involved with the KKK,
Mm-hmm.
but word has it down that they thought highly of a lot of the people that were involved,
Sure.
that they were the better people
Sure.
of the community.
Yeah.
Dr. So-and-so,
Yeah.
so-and-so with
Yeah.
a nice big farm were,
Yep.
were involved.
Yep. Yeah, and I mean, there's some really interesting duality to the membership of the Ku Klux during Reconstruction, because on one hand, some of it is the best men. Shotwell certainly envisioned himself as that, and if you read his memoir, he'll say that he took the charge of the Rutherford Den as a way of trying to rein it in, that it was kind of out of control, and that it was basically young men getting drunk and doing stupid things. Which, there's some irony there as well, because Shotwell's not that old, and he himself may have also had an alcohol problem. So, Shotwell takes us on, says that he's going to kind of rein it in, and there is this sort of dichotomy that there are some of the better men who saw the Ku Klux originally as sort of a useful vehicle to organizing. And then it starts to take on a life of its own. And one of the things that I do see and talk a fair bit about and know a fair bit about, and I would refer here to my future co-author on the book that Dick said that I'm working on Reconstruction broadly. His name's Bruce Stewart. He teaches at Appalachian State. And he's written a book on the history of moonshine in Western North Carolina from roughly 1790 to early 1900s. There was a lot of moonshining going on down in Rutherford, Polk, in this sort of area. And a lot of those moonshiners got involved in the Ku Klux because they were using it as a way to oppose the Federal Revenue Service. And they didn't want to pay taxes on their moonshine. That also ties into the spiraling of the organization. And Shotwell, I don't think, understood that, or certainly doesn't write about it. But that's a part of what's happening. Is that there are people who have their own agenda, and then they see what's happening in some cases when they go on this raid on justice in Rutherfordton, and they're like, hey, wait, we don't want to do that. We just want to make sure that we don't have to pay our taxes. And then some of them flip, and they start testifying against what they had seen. So, I mean, it's messy, and Shotwell will largely not name names, except for one. He very publicly gets in a spat in the 1870s or 1880s, early 1880s, with a guy by the name of David Schenck, who was a lawyer from Lincoln County. And Schenck was a candidate for the state Supreme Court. And Shotwell basically came out, to use a contemporary phrase, with receipts, basically proving that Schenck was involved in all the sorts of things that Schenck then denounced. So, yeah, that's the only time that I found where Shotwell, but again, Schenck was one of the better people. His agenda was maybe different from the moonshiners, and the moonshiners' agenda was maybe different from the Shotwells, and it's just, the Klan becomes an umbrella for pretty much all resistance against federal power at that point.
I've got a
Yes, sir.
comment. I come from the north. I read the history books that were prevalent in those days, and it would seem to me, the impression that I got from reading the books, the Ku Klux Klan was prevalent throughout this part of the world, and most of the South. Did you find?
Yeah. Well, and I think it's important, too, to keep in mind that the Reconstruction era Ku Klux is different from the early 20th century Ku Klux, which is different from the modern Ku Klux, and there's sort of connective tissue and evolution. The Reconstruction era Ku Klux was very much designed about the resistance to African American civil rights. It was very much in resistance to federal revenue laws locally. And sort of these sort of broader issues, they're more or less destroyed by the early 1870s and more or less go away. They will pop up, and maybe this comes up in the local. I see some newspaper accounts in the 1870s claiming that they popped up again, even I think here. I didn't see anything come out of it, so I think it was just one of those rumors where something happened, somebody called it Ku Klux, I'm not sure. But yeah, they largely are gone, dissolved, and then what comes around in the early 20th century is comparable, but they're basically taking the name and the legacy and readapting it, right? The birth of the quote-unquote second Ku Klux Klan comes with the the midst of the Red Scare post-World War I and the sort of airing of Birth of a Nation, the movie, and sort of galvanizes people into sort of this new wave of violence, and then that kind of dies down and it comes back again in the 50s. Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
How much violence was there, though, in, say, the 1890s and early 1900s by organizations that didn't even claim to be the Ku Klux Klan?
Yeah.
The red shirts, for instance.
Yeah, no, there's a good amount of violence that pops up again. And it is, times of stress and turmoil, and I know in Buncombe County there's a campaign right now to commemorate this, sort of lynching victims and other sorts of incidents of violence that happened in sort of the late 19th, early 20th century. I have a friend from graduate school who wrote his dissertation about the murder and lynching of a black man in the 1920s in Asheville. And again, there's this sort of wave and sort of distinctiveness that's interesting in the sense that there is a big population shift and sort of an influx in the early 20th century of African Americans coming out of like Spartanburg County, South Carolina, and moving to Asheville, looking for textile mill jobs and other sorts of jobs, but also the idea that Asheville would be more racially tolerant than, say, Spartanburg. So they move up there, and then, what often happens in those sorts of instances is then there's this sort of, discomfort with the swell of black population and labor competition, and then that leads to violence and things like that as well.
My question is probably neither, I don't know in which category it falls, but I ask this because I know my father's side had come from Madison County.
Mm-hmm.
Was there something special about Madison County during that period that...
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the things I've thought a lot about since this book came out, and if I had to do it over again, I think one of the things that I would really, and maybe I'll get a chance to do it over again with this other project, but one of the things I would really tease out and think about is just how, for lack of a better word, irrelevant some of the borders are between states. Madison County bleeds right into Greene County, Tennessee. And a lot of people in sort of Madison and northwest North Carolina, the Yancey area, Mitchell County, they're going to East Tennessee to go to town, right? They're going to Jonesboro. That's where they're going to buy from stores. That's where, so there's a lot of shifting back and forth. And, the big sort of incident in the Civil War era, of course, in Madison County is the Shelton-Laurel Massacre. And people involved in the Shelton-Laurel Massacre fled across into Greene County and were sort of hiding out with family and whatnot just across the border. So I think one of the things that's unique and interesting about Madison County is it tends to be perhaps a little bit more unionist than some of the other sections. It borders a very unionist county in Greene County. There's familial connections back and forth. They go to town in Jonesboro. So there's a lot of really interesting relationships there that I don't tease out in the book that I think are very much present. And to sort of bring it back down here, again, the permeability of the county, like what I talked about, Reconstruction era Ku Klux are crossing borders. They're coming from other counties into communities to carry out raids so that people in these communities can't be targeted and sort of pinned to it. So there's people coming from Spartanburg County, York County, South Carolina coming into North Carolina. There's people coming from Cleveland County over towards Rutherford County. There's people in Madison County who are, getting raided from people from Yancey County or Buncombe County. And there's a lot of movement in it and a lot of permeability. But Madison, it's a relatively more rugged terrain. It's on the border. It shares a lot with Greene County. Greene County is very unionist. There's a very sizable unionist population in Madison. That really makes things, you know, messy, complicated.
Yeah, there was a sense that some of that migration to areas like Polk County and upper South Carolina was because farming was much more compatible than trying to farm in the mountains. And that also stimulated a lot of that migration for some of those folks.
Yeah, yeah, Madison's, yeah.
Okay. Anybody else on the big picture? Yes, Joy.
On a big picture, as a teacher teaching in the 70s, 80s, and the 90s, many people would come up to me and say, how come the kids aren't learning history, American history? You know, they constantly, well, we didn't have the resources of the internet in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. The publishing companies, low bids, were all Texas. So we, as a curriculum committee of teachers, going through all the history books, oh, this is the one we want. This is from California. This has something, you know, broader picture, African Americans, the Reconstruction. And then the low bid cuts us and we get the book. And back then, it was the book that we had to use unless we would supplement it. So Reconstruction, if we were lucky, if there were 2 sentences about Reconstruction. Boy, they had to learn the Civil War, all the battles, all the battles. World War I, all the you know, and World War. But 2 sentences, lucky to have it for Reconstruction. So the resources now are just.
What about European history?
Yeah.
Yes, sir. You have not had a chance
One
yet.
quick question.
Please.
You had mentioned at the start, you said the use of slaves before the Civil War was more so in the, but I think it was over 50% in South Carolina.
Yeah, no, South Carolina.
There were North Carolina counties that had a majority.
Yeah, sure.
But not in this part of the state.
So it was,
It depended a lot on what part.
on the level of the way the ground was.
Yeah. But I would also point out that there's an interesting element to the Western story, which is that a lot of South Carolina planters, even in the antebellum period, vacationed up and around Asheville and Western North Carolina. So there would be a seasonal influx of African Americans coming at different times. In fact, the Carl Sandburg House was originally the summer home of the Confederate Secretary of the Treasury, Christopher Memminger. So, yeah.
Excellent. Okay, anybody else with remarks or questions? And we can dive into the local. Okay, we have one question, and I'd like to help on this. Bill asked a question about what about Polk during this period. Something I'd like to offer is that, unlike Asheville, there was no local media source that provides us primary source material. And so when we get to this local place, Polk County, what we may find is some mention from elsewhere, say Asheville, Charlotte, even Raleigh, in contemporary sources, but the kinds of rich material that he is able to access about what was going on in Buncombe, let's say, is not available here. So it's a little harder to get definitive answers, right? Yeah, yeah.
Well, to that extent, when I was doing some research regarding gold mining in the area, I found an article in a Shelby paper that referenced what was going on in the gold mining in Polk County. But so it was from Shelby
Right.
To your point.
It can
It
happen.
had to come from outside the area because there was nothing local at that point.
Right.
But it talked about the farmers, the health of the community, and what was going on regarding the gold mining at that point in time.
Right.
From Shelby.
Certainly one of the most remarkable things that you showed tonight, Steve, and I'd like to give you an opportunity to address it,
Sure.
is that you showed clearly that during Reconstruction, Polk had 20% black people.
Well,
Which
the
was-
registered black voters.
Right. Which was fairly close to the Western North Carolina average that we saw. And we also saw that in the election of 1868, Polk voted 80% for the Republican candidate. So the contrast of the numbers here to some other counties is interesting to all of us.
Right.
Would you like to take a shot at commenting on that?
Yeah, in terms of like, let's see, I can even, there's the sort of numbers. You can see the Polk and Rutherford kind of. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different possibilities as to why that was. Republicans tended to poll well and they polled really well in Rutherford. And there was a very strong Republican organization in Rutherford that I suspect probably also influenced what was happening over here. One of the sort of more significant Republican leaders in this area was George Washington Logan. He was a judge and a Republican official. I suspect that probably also feeds into it. I believe there's also something about, and I don't know this off the top of my head, I don't have the document to sort of prove this, but one of the things that the Republicans were promoting pretty profoundly was railroad development. And they were willing and had supported the idea of using state money to build railroads, and did that, and this gets them into a lot of trouble by using bonds, and they ended up in a sort of fraudulent bond scenario. But everybody talks about the Western North Carolina Railroad, which is what they were doing. There was another railroad coming, which was from the south, which ends up becoming the Spartanburg and Asheville Railroad. And that will have a significant impact because it'll come up through here, head towards Henderson County, and then on to Asheville. And it's actually, for all the talk about the Western North Carolina Railroad, the Spartanburg and Asheville Railroad, the Spartanburg and Asheville Railroad gets there first. It sort of rolls up through,
This building here.
Yeah. So the railroad, I think, has a lot to do with what's popular down here. I think a lot of the reason that, from the extent I could tell that would be unpopular amongst the Republicans would be the moonshining and the federal revenue laws. But as you can see, in 1868, they're doing quite well. And I would also point out, when we talk about the 1868 Constitution, this also was a big selling point, because the 1868 Constitution changed it changed the way that local government was done, which was that local government used to be where it would be appointed by the state legislature, and then they made it elective. So it was very popular in Western North Carolina, broadly speaking, to have elective local government. And it also plays into an old long-standing argument, which was that the western part of the state was largely overlooked by the rest of the state, and they were overpowered in representation because when you use the federal basis of population, which at that time included the enslaved population, they lost out in terms of representation. They didn't get as much representation in the state legislature. So I suspect that, like a lot of these counties, Polk here immediately has an interest in the sort of benefit to railroad, although the Western North Carolina Railroad won't tie here, but I suspect railroad development because the aforementioned Christopher Memminger and others were a big proponent of the Spartanburg and Asheville Railroad, but also the Constitution and the idea that they would get, and I mean this in a small d, democratic local government was a big selling point.
So to some extent, civil rights was trumped by economic development.
To some extent, yeah. And I think in some extent that's the payoff of the end part of my book, which is that after the Ku Klux Klan kind of rolls through, Republicans and conservatives kind of start trying to figure out a way to kind of move forward. And the easiest move forward for Western North Carolinians was economic development. That they all kind of had a skin in the game in terms of getting a railroad, in terms of getting these market connections so that they could get their goods in and get goods out. And if you sort of look back up around where I live, and sort of comes back, what's interesting about Madison County is after the Civil War, there's a huge tobacco boom in Buncombe, Madison, and Haywood counties. And when you look at it, they used that to sell the railroad. Right, we need to get this stuff to Durham. We need to get this stuff to Danville.
That was another thing I picked up in reading your book, a little off this specific subject, but I was curious. You didn't say, I'm assuming that was all burley tobacco. That's what would be grown in that part of the country today.
It's bright leaf
Well,
tobacco.
bright leaf tobacco was grown in western North Carolina.
During the 1870s and whatnot, and then it switches burley around the
Oh,
1890s.
okay, I wasn't clear on
Yeah.
that from,
Yeah.
I'm glad that came up.
Because I have a colleague at East Tennessee State, his name's Tom Lee, and he's writing on Appalachian tobacco. He's writing largely about burley because he does late 19th, early 20th, but it was bright initially. And then that more or less dies out by early 1890s.
You probably are aware, but just in case you're not, Columbus, our county seat, was named for Columbus Mills, who was very much involved in the Old Order. He served as Secretary of State of North Carolina. He was very much involved with the secession administration, let's say, in Raleigh on a state basis. And so he was more of a local figure. You guys probably, if you've been around, know that there have been some programs here in Polk County about Columbus Mills and the intensely personal conflicts. The Weavers, the murders you've heard about. I think it's probably worth considering that this result wasn't just about politics or economics, that it was intensely personal. And so a year after this result, Columbus Mills left for good, and his property was bought by the people from Pennsylvania, McAvoy, Wilcox, and the syndicate that they put together, and he moved himself to Cabarrus County and never returned.
Okay.
So that's worth considering. Why don't we say then, we're breaking up, but we can still have one-on-one conversations, right? Meet you.
Fine with me. I just want to thank everybody for being here and
Thank
for your
you.
participation.
Wonderful.
And